Gangue Architecture. This presentation is an exploration and reflection on my research with air grid structures. You can see a couple of air grid structures in the picture shown in this slide. As you can see, an air grid is a three-dimensional lattice made of coloured thread sewn into a supporting armature. I began working in earnest on air grid when I did my PhD way back at the turn of the millennium, but I had already begun to formulate air grid as a project even before then. You can see a group of propedeutic air grid structures in the picture shown in this slide. At the time I made them, I had spent many years working in mainstream architectural practice and was just beginning to move into teaching. My appetite for history and theory had been fired up thanks to a master's course I had just completed at the Bartlett, and I was keen to bring speculative thinking and techniques of design together in a single project. From my years in practice, the thing that left the strongest impression and was to become a lasting fascination was the use of the grid as a frame of reference in production drawings. I can remember, while I was making drawings, thinking how good it would be to clear the grid lines of all that unnecessary clutter, the outlines and graphic textures delineating bricks, blocks, gaskets, I-beams, chunks of concrete, stud work, plaster, glass, and so on. All of that yet to come corporeality of construction seemed to me to be getting in the way of something that pointed in another direction and might lead to a whole new field of creative endeavour. One place where grids seemed to have achieved a degree of freedom was in the paintings of Agnes Martin. You can see one of Martin's paintings in the picture shown in this slide. Martin didn't only work with grids, but in the 1960s she seems to have been especially fascinated by the grid form, where it appears in many of her paintings. The one shown in this slide is called Flower in the Wind from 1963. It measures approximately 190 centimetres square, and when you get up close you can see how the grid has been made to appear by drawing pencil lines over a lightly painted canvas. There is some variety among Martin's grid paintings, but one thing they all have in common is their flattened, geometric orderliness. As one critic put it, these paintings reveal what art looks like when it turns its back on nature. And, insofar as the painting represents anything at all, it is the warp and weft of the canvas that is inscribed and depicted in the figure of the grid. The grid traces, doubles and maps onto the canvas surface, but it does not fuse with the surface, rather it is a ghostly figure that hovers in front like a gossamer veil. As I've already said, my own desire to make grids came from my experience as an architectural designer, and in architecture we are trained to think in 3 dimensions, not in 2. Although the grids I make are, like Martin's, ghostly and hovering, they do not hover in front of a canvas, but inside a specially crafted armature that supports and frames them. Working out how to craft an air grid was rather challenging. It was a major focus of my PhD, and even at the end of that process was still not resolved to my satisfaction, but I had certainly made significant progress in mastering the art. In those days, there were no fabrication laboratories and laser cutters. I had to make everything by hand. I spent a considerable amount of time working with foam board, punching small holes with mapping pins and scouring and making slits with scalpel blades. Since then, with the advent of digital manufacturing technologies, making the support armature has become much easier, and I can now use transparent acrylic and corrugated card to make the support armature, but my basic motive for making air grid remains the same. And this brings me to one of the central questions guiding my research, because I don't really know what my motive is. I simply cannot understand why anyone, myself included, would want to make air grid structures. One way of addressing this question has recently led me to return to the case of Agnes Martin. Martin is known to have suffered from schizophrenia. Sometimes an episode would leave her with no idea who or where she was, leading to her hospitalisation. The condition made it difficult for her to cope with the publicity, exhibitions and critical acclaim that typically accompany success in the art world. In the late 1960s, Martin found it so difficult to cope she decided to give up painting forever. She left New York and went to live in New Mexico, where she remained for the rest of her life, living in remote, sparsely populated areas on those curious geological formations called mesa, essentially a flat-topped hill or small plateau with steep sides. Martin's resolution to give up painting did not last. She took up the practice again after just 7 years and painted for the rest of her life. She continued to paint grids, but also began to experiment with horizontal bands or just horizontal lines painted on lightly coloured grounds. Reproduced photographically in art books, Martin's paintings can sometimes look like tasteful fabric designs. However, seen in an art gallery, they appear as large areas of faint, even tone. Sometimes they look blank, but if you ever get to stand up close to one and gaze at it, as it were, in the flesh, it is tactile, shimmering, quietly resonant and responsive to nuances of ambient light, impossible to capture in a photograph. Martin was quite open about her mental health and often referred to the inner voices that seemed to come to her from the outside. As recounted in conversations with those who knew her well, she seems to have regarded the voices as her muse, claiming they were the inspiration and guiding force behind her paintings. Martin often speculated about what it means to be an artist, especially what it means to be a good one. Her devotion to the voices was her answer to that question. Based on what she said and wrote about them, the voices appeared to serve as a conduit, allowing her to communicate directly with her inner mind. You could get a better understanding of what I mean from these extracts, which are taken from a text Martin wrote entitled "What is Real?" The artist tries to live in a way that will make greater awareness of the sublimity of reality possible. I want to emphasize the fact that we all have the same concern, but the artist must know exactly what the experience is. He must pursue the truth relentlessly. The manipulation of materials in artwork is a result of this state of mind. The artist works by awareness of his own state of mind. There is one great difference from man to man that I must mention. It is a difference in willingness to perform his function. Each of us is born to a certain function. When an artist becomes aware of his exact function, that is when he knows, suddenly, exactly what he will do and how he will do it. Setting aside Martin's use of pronouns, which is probably just a reflection of the linguistic norms of her time, I find it hard to take her speculations about art and the role of the artist seriously. What interests me about the case of Agnes Martin is the supposedly abnormal condition of her mind, i.e. her experience with schizophrenia. I prefer to view her artistic practice as a sort of psychotropic mechanism. I don't mean psychotropic in the sense of ingesting substances, I mean psychotropic in the sense of actively shaping and engaging her lived environment in a manner that allowed her to moderate her emotional and psychological state. Although she found her lifestyle intuitively and through lived experience, I think she filtered and interpreted her way of being through the spiritual and contemplative language evident in her writing. In my view, the case of Agnes Martin very nicely illuminates the therapeutic value of making art, and, although so far as I know, I myself have no notable mental health condition, a partial answer to my question about why I make a grid is because in doing so, I am able to regulate my emotional and psychological state. However, I'm not convinced that is the full answer, and so for the rest of this presentation I'm going to be approaching my research question from a different direction, one I've never taken before. I now want to turn to a phenomenon that I've only recently discovered. It is a form of folk, or is it proletarian art, that I encountered during a trip to the Northern Pennines. It is called spar boxes, and I hadn't heard of it until I visited an old Victorian lead mining site at a place called Kilhope, which has recently been opened to the public as a lead mining museum. Kilhope is located at the top of Weardale in County Durham, and at 460 metres above sea level, it claims to be the highest museum in England. The tour inside the mine is the highlight of the Kilhope experience. You can see the entrance in the picture shown in this slide, but the museum has other attractions too, one of which is its collection of spar boxes. You can see a spar box in this image. The spars are the crystalline rock deposits that you can see have been built into the box. These crystalline deposits are the unwanted products of mining, known as gangue materials, which are extracted along with the valuable material but have no significant economic value themselves. We will return to gangue materials in a moment. For now, I want to briefly outline the geology of the Northern Pennines and how it informs the practice of lead mining. The underlying geology of the Northern Pennine region is comprised of a series of thin beds of limestone, shales and sandstones. They were laid down some 310 million years ago in the shallow seas and deltas of the Carboniferous era. These rock layers are tilted. They slope down to the east to gradually disappear under the later rocks of the Durham coalfield. To the west they rise up gently until a major fault line cuts them off to reveal the Pennine escarpment that towers over the Eden Valley. At some point after they were laid down, these carboniferous beds were subjected to immense pressure. The pressure was relieved by a network of cracks and fissures, fault lines, splintering the beds and creating pathways for mineral-rich fluids to seep in from deeper layers. As the fluids pushed upwards, away from the heat, they cooled down and solidified, thereby transforming the fault lines into two distinct types, mineral veins and vugs. Let me explain the difference. Mineral-rich fluids typically follow one of two paths when solidifying within a fault line. In the first scenario, the fluid completely fills the fault and hardens into a solid mass. This is known as a vein. In the second scenario, the fluid only partially fills the fault, leaving behind hollow cavities. As the fluid cools, individual mineral crystals begin to grow within these voids through a process called crystallization. These crystal-lined cavities are known as vugs. Vugs can vary greatly in size. Some are small enough to fit in your hand, while others are large enough for a person to crawl into or even stand up and walk around inside. This account from 1904, written by the leader of a team of miners, describes what it was like to enter a vug immediately after it had been broken into. You find yourself surrounded by crystallized fluorite, the only stepping places being points and angles of 6-inch cubes. you admire the various shades of purple, blue and heliotrope in the translucent crystals and notice that some of the others are pale and cloudy. As you move carefully along its winding course, new forms of grouping arrest the eye, and you note that some of the cubes are studded with calcite and others are coated with fine white quartz. The diamond-like sparkle of the latter showing very effectively against the dark background of fluor. Another bend and you are confronted with an isolated cube measuring 12 inches across its face and perfect in every line and angle. Having walked for some 20 or 30 feet, you find your further progress barred, although the vista of beauty still extends as far as the light of your candle can penetrate. So as you can see from the description, Vugs are visually striking, featuring faceted crystals and highly polished glass-like surfaces that reflect and refract light in all directions, creating a dazzling gem-like appearance. Miners were naturally drawn to Vugs, and during their hours of work they would often take a moment to collect crystal specimens from these captivating spaces. This habit, however, was frowned upon by the mining companies, who saw it as a waste of time and would sometimes order the Vug to be sealed off. Still, because of their hands-on role in the excavation process, miners were almost always the first to discover Vugs, and more often than not they found clever ways to keep their finds hidden from the watchful eyes of management. The miners worked out ways to carefully extract the good quality specimens and smuggle them out of the mine. There was a marketplace for good mineral specimens, and these could be sold on to dealers. But some miners collected mineral specimens for themselves and, in their non-working hours, would craft these into three-dimensional assemblies built into glass cabinets or fitted to the interiors of glass-fronted wooden boxes. These were known as spar boxes. Sometimes mirrors would be added and handcrafted figures might be included in the composition, toy-like evocations of everyday life. Spar boxes were often displayed in local events, including competitions with prizes for the best spar box. A version of a spar box even made it to the Great Exhibition of 1851, where a working miner named Isaac Robinson is said to have fitted up a display of some 2,000 mineral specimens in a manner corresponding to some small collections which he had cemented together during the intervals of his ordinary hours of work and had been much admired. As you can see from the images I'm showing, spar boxes were made in a variety of shapes and sizes and have variable aesthetic qualities. It has to be said, some of them are quite ugly. I'm going to bring this presentation to a close by giving 4 reasons why I am interested in spar boxes. First, insofar as each one can be understood as a small, contained, 3-dimensional space that can be looked into but not entered, they remind me of Air Grid. Second, spar box is an art form practiced outside the art institution, and as such it offers an alternative model for thinking about why people make art. Third, and this is closely related to the second, spar box can be understood as a kind of psychotropic mechanism, acting on the minds of the miners who made them and of the family members and wider community who gazed on them, helping to moderate emotional and psychological states. The fourth sense in which the spar box phenomenon is interesting to me relates to the Vug spaces directly, where the crystals were found, and to the concept of gangue material, which I mentioned earlier in this talk. Gangue material is the official term for waste materials associated with mining processes. If we look more closely at the extractive processes used in the kind of lead mining I'm discussing here, an interesting complication arises regarding what was considered gang. To clarify this, I want to highlight two key points. First, the materials deemed industrially valuable, galena, sphalerite and later fluorite, are, ironically, also the most commonly found crystals in spar boxes. The second point to consider is that the solidified material within a vein was more predictable, making it more cost-effective to extract and process. Predictable and cost-effective, that is, compared to the material in a vug. As a result, mining within a vein was more valuable to the mining company, and we've already seen how mining companies were wary of vug spaces and often instructed mine managers to cover them up. Thanks to what the mining company viewed as an imperfection in the process, potentially valuable materials could end up being classified as non-industrial or gang. Depending on their aesthetic appeal, let's call this beauty for the sake of argument, these materials could attain the rare status of art. Whether they were placed in museum collections or crafted into spar boxes, the crucial point is this: the transformation of gang material into art relied entirely on the abstract, reductive nature of the industrial process, which, while producing certain materials as valuable, also produced other forms of matter as excluded. It is my contention that air grid too is a species of excluded matter. Not an exclusion produced by the kinds of abstractions involved in turning raw materials into industrial goods. Rather, air grid is an exclusion produced by the kinds of abstractions involved in turning design concepts into buildings and other places in cities, towns and countryside.